Great. Thank you for coming. We'll go ahead and begin. We're very pleased today to have Mr. Jose Brillantes, who is the chairperson of the Committee on Migrant Workers. He will be presenting to the Third Committee of the General Assembly this afternoon at 3 p.m. And I'll just pass the floor to him to make some remarks, and he'd be happy to take questions. Please go ahead, Mr. Brillantes. There you go.
Yes. Good morning to one and all, and thank you very much, Ravina, for your very kind words of introduction. Indeed, as chair of the Committee on Migrant Workers, I'm going to be presenting our report to the Third Committee this afternoon. And since part of that report is going to be the Global Compact one, which has been the flavor of the year for the last so many months, and it has punctuated so many meetings all over the world trying to come up with the Global Compact. I thought that I would just tie up the relevance of the Committee on Migrant Workers of the United Nations to the Global Compact. I think that's the main idea. Of course, in the report for this afternoon, we were going to do the yearly report, and I will just rattle that off later this afternoon, although of course it will tie in also with the Global Compact. So the main point is really that the Committee on Migrant Workers, or CMW for short, is supposed to be the most relevant UN body when it comes to migrants' rights. And unfortunately, in the past, the CMW has been marginalized in the sense that the committee itself has not been invited. There were no overtures for us to make a presentation from the time that it all began in September of 2016, and then the high-level meeting, and then the outcome document, and then all of the thematic meetings, 6 of them, until finally in the last meeting, we were finally invited with a nameplate, unlike before where we had to barge in. Of course, I don't know whether this is official or should be off the record. But anyway, we're happy that this is so, because the committee is really one or two of the 10 treaty bodies that are very, very relevant to the Global Compact. And to tie it in, therefore, the Committee on Migrant Workers and the Global Compact, it is very, very simple. The Treaty on the Protection, it's a very long name, the Treaty on the Protection of the Rights of all Migrant Workers and members of their families, is not just guiding but binding. It has the force of law. In fact, in all of the documentation that came out, the high-level conference and the outcome documents and the thematic meetings, the committee is always mentioned. Many of its principles and provisions are all mentioned there. And the question was, and of course I felt sorry for my committee, because why were we not being invited? Finally, we are invited in the last one, which is fine. And my vice chairman is going to be one of the speakers there, so we will be able to articulate. And also, finally, we have been given a chance to present a short 3 to 5 page document to be presented to the representative of the Secretary General, who will then collate all or most of this, and we hope that it's going to be incorporated in the final documents, which will come out in 2018. Of course, this is going to be really a game changer with 123 countries involved. And of course, the difference is that in the committee, it is binding, legally binding. It has the force of law. And of course, we all know now that the sentiment for the Global Compact on Migration is that it is guiding and it is not going to be legally binding. But since 193 countries are going to be involved, and since they also keep referring to the provisions of our convention, the CMW, we hope that the binding force of the CMW will rub off on the final document of the Global Compact on Migration. That is the essence of what we wanted to contribute. And hopefully that is going to be picked up, and all of the strains of our provisions in the committee will go into the Global Compact. Of course, I had called on Luis Arbor, who is the representative of the Secretary General for the Global Compact, and we have articulated this position, and hopefully it can be covered also by the final outcome documents of the Global Compact. It's probably at this point where we want to say that the provisions of the treaties, we already know this, we have this memorized, we know this by heart, everybody knows this, but it is no longer time for advocating the advocacies, or it's no longer time for declaring the declarations. We know this already. It is time to pick up the points where they are doable, where they are actionable, and where 193 countries or so are going to be able to get together and say, this is what we're going to do. And therefore, probably, even if they do not, and I have to go to ratification, there are only 51 ratifications in our convention, even if they probably, most of them have not yet ratified, either they will push for ratification, or even if they don't, if the Global Compact is such that there is unanimity, it probably will, as I said earlier, the legality and binding nature will rub off on the guiding nature of the Global Compact. I think I will stop there. I just wanted to say finally that perhaps it is at this point where we will be able to define where the human rights of migrants begin and the sovereign rights of countries involved in migration will end, and how they are going to be able to blend with each other in order to help the migrant worker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Brillantes. Thank you very much for that introduction to the role of the Global Compact. Do you have a question? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Evelyn Leopold. Here is the, now we can read it while you talk. Tell me about the treaty. How many have signed and how many have ratified?
Yes. So,
And then secondly, and I could ask it later, do you have some examples of where you think the labor force is being respected, and how much work there's still needed in a majority of countries?
okay, I didn't get the second part of the question, please. Sorry. Do I have any examples
Of where migrant workers are doing well or respected, and where they're being,
yes,
where
okay.
they're not?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. There are 51 countries that have ratified the convention, and there are 15 that are signatories to the convention. But because of the legislative process in their home countries, it takes a little while for them to do that. For example, in Brazil, that has indicated that they will sign. There are 4 special committees in their legislative branch that are still studying it, and it will take a little time. And that's probably one of the reasons why it is taking some time for the ratifications to go up. Although in the last year, we were able to get 3 ratifications and 1 signatory.
You have 51 ratifications.
Yes.
How many do you need for the treaty to go into force?
It's already in force.
It's in force,
Yes,
yeah.
it's in force. It's been in force since 1990, but it is the second smallest of the 10 treaty bodies under the United Nations. Yes. And with respect to, I'm just trying to piece together your last question to be able to answer.
It's on the countries that respect and fail to respect migrants' rights. The countries that respect and the countries that fail to respect migrants' rights.
Okay. I guess it's not a matter of categorically putting it that way, but I'd like to say that the receiving countries, absolutely or almost none of them are signatories. Most of the signatories are the sending countries, although there are some that are both sending and receiving countries, some that are also sending countries and destination countries, and in the migratory process, also the countries where they have to pass through. And for instance, the European Union, I cannot think of one that has signed the documentation, the treaty. As a matter of fact, I think I'll go out on a limb and say that this committee was created through mainly the efforts of the General Assembly way back in the 80s. And the first chair was Mexico. Yeah. And Mexico was really very, very committed to getting this committee formed and will become one of the major committees of the United Nations. I happen to have attended that, having been assigned to Washington, D.C. at that particular time as a junior officer. So I knew exactly what was going on. And at that particular time, even as the most vocal and the most participative members of that formative committee were from Europe and from the Americas. I can mention Finland, Italy, Japan, and a few others. They were the most vocal and the most participative. But during off breaks and during recesses, they would say, we are not going to sign that anyway. So obviously, there was already this bias, but that's okay. It passed. After 30 ratifications, it came into being. We were able to elect the committee, and now we have already reviewed no less than 40 countries. We do whatever is normal for a committee, and this has gone through now. And therefore, there is this seeming reluctance. But I think that all of these countries that have not indicated that they will ratify are in the Global Compact, also all very, very active. And I think that this is going to tell them and tell everybody that there should be some form of impetus on the part of these participants in the Global Compact, although they may or may not, although there will be a thrust for ratification of the CMW. If they don't, their participation in the Global Compact is going to be such that it will be a game changer. 193 countries participating, and will come up by 2018 with the Global Compact on Migration, I am quite sure that this is going to have the kind of guidance and almost legally binding, not legally binding, but even stronger binding on those who have participated in the Global Compact.
Yes, please go ahead.
Mauricio Guerrero, Mexican News Agency. Thank you so much, Mr. Brillantes. What are the issues that are lacking now in the discussions on the Global Compact? And why do you think the committee has been sided on these debates? And my other question is, do you think the Global Compact really will have the power to change the migration dynamics and the attitudes of developed countries toward migrants, for example, in Europe and in North America? Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that as I was trying to explain, I don't know whether I was able to do that successfully, but this is really almost a voluntary thrust on all of the countries that have participated. And this process has begun as early as 2015, 16, 17, and it will culminate in 2018 with literally hundreds of thematic meetings and conferences all over the world. So the participation has been such that it will have some kind of moral responsibility and situation on the participants to make sure that what they are articulating and what they will approve, they will also follow, even if they do not ratify the most relevant convention that is being used in the compact itself. And that will probably look, I guess, nicer, if you want to put it that way, because while the EU and other countries have not ratified, since they are participating and will presumably approve the final outcome document of the Global Compact, they will have some responsibility to be true to what they sign in the Global Compact.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot. Lee, Intercity Press. Thanks for this briefing. I wanted to, if you don't mind, ask you about sort of a few either country-specific or it's very high profile, the issue, for example, in Qatar, where they're building stadiums for the World Cup. They bring in migrant workers. There's some people have died in the heat, and there's issues about people's passports. I just wanted to know, how does these, and the other thing is also in the news is there's a crackdown on the export by North Korea of its workers. I don't know if you would consider, I guess they're migrant workers, whether, so there are two questions. I wanted to ask you what you think is the role. There's also it's been alleged that Burundi, for example, made commitments to Gulf states to send a number of domestic workers. So how prevalent is this becoming that some states themselves are the ones sort of providing and in a way profiting off their own expatriate workforce? And how can this issue be addressed?
Yes, that's really very true. So if, for instance, in the matter of the World Cup, if the country where that's going to be held were a signatory to the CMW, then we could issue any and all of the documentation plus the reports of our committees to call to task a signatory of this particular committee. Unfortunately, the Gulf states are not yet signatories. And with respect to the other countries that are sending and in effect are in cahoots, so to speak, with the receiving countries, the process is such that each and every country has certain laws, rules, regulations, labor laws, recruitment laws that will make sure that the recruited workers fall under a specific qualification all in terms of age, in terms of special capacities or skills, etc., etc. They are all qualified, but the problem becomes enormous where there are no laws, rules, and regulations that will regulate the regularity or irregularity, but these are the words used in the convention, the legality or illegality, actually, of the entry of these workers to the place of work or employment. There are those who can go via the back door, those who are really recruited directly, which are not usually allowed, and they end up there, and they become the big problem because then they have no recourse, for instance, to even the legal processes of the receiving countries, and that compounds the problem. And in the case of our committee or my committee, we are now beginning to look at the possibility of coming up with some statements to the effect that as long as there is a signatory country probably involved, we can factor in, or even, for lack of a better word, incriminate the non-signatory country who normally we would call to task, but we are unable to because they are not members. But we can include them in the deliberations for the violations by certain workers or certain practices of the signatory state. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. Yes, please go ahead with your question.
One quick question. Who monitors the treaty? Is that your committee? Who monitors the adherence to the treaty and the review of it?
Yeah, we monitor the implementation of the treaty, and this monitoring now culminates every year in the report that we are going to make this afternoon. Yes, and our monitoring, we report to the General Assembly, and they will also decide what they're going to do with us. Because obviously, if the General Assembly finds that we are remiss, or we have shortcomings, or we have not done this, or we have done too much, etc., they will call us to task, and probably the power of the budget will also come in.
Yes, I can send you the report that he'll be presenting to the GA this afternoon. Yeah, sure. All right, great. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to get in touch, and we'll direct them.